Across Europe, an ancient kingdom ruled by blood, law, and tradition stood older than the Church's growing authority. For centuries, kings ruled by divine belief, commanding armies, while bishops answered directly to the throne. This balance survived wars and plagues, binding crown and altar through fragile but powerful agreement. But beneath obedience, resentment grew as Rome watched kings control sacred offices. In Rome, a new pope believed kings had corrupted God's order beyond forgiveness. He studied law and scripture, convinced the church must rule above every crown. Far north, a young king inherited a throne shaped by warriors and ancient custom. He believed God crowned kings directly, not through papal permission. The king appointed bishops freely, strengthening his rule through loyal churchmen. To Rome, these acts were theft souls taken by royal hands. Letters crossed Europe, warnings sharp as blades, demanding obedience from the throne. The king ignored Rome, trusting his nobles and ancestral authority. The pope saw defiance not as politics, but heresy against heaven. By 1076 AD, patience ended, and judgment replaced negotiation. A decree was prepared that would shake kingdoms without a single sword drawn. Few understood the danger of words spoken by God's claimed representative. The Pope believed he held heaven's keys, even over kings. The king believed crowns were older than Rome's commands. Two beliefs now raced toward collision across a divided Europe. Unknowingly, both prepared to ignite the most dangerous war of authority ever recorded. In Rome, behind stone walls and burning candles, the Pope prepared a decree meant to unmake a king without spilling blood. Church councils gathered as whispers spread that something unprecedented was about to be spoken before all of Christendom. The Pope believed kings had forgotten their place, turning sacred offices into tools of earthly ambition. He spoke of divine order, claiming heaven itself demanded the separation of crown from sacred authority. Across the Alps, the king ruled confidently, unaware that his authority was being quietly dismantled in Rome. The decree accused the king of disobedience, corruption, and rebellion against God's appointed order. No pope had ever dared declare a reigning king unfit to rule by divine law. Yet Gregory believed fear was necessary, for kings only bowed when heaven threatened them. The decree stripped the king of divine favor, severing him from the church's protection. Messengers carried the words across Europe, riding through snow, forests, and hostile lands. When the decree reached German nobles, loyalty wavered as fear of damnation took hold. The Pope's words carried invisible force, stronger than armies, sharper than swords. By declaring excommunication, the Pope released subjects from obedience to their king. For the first time, spiritual power openly challenged royal legitimacy across all Europe. The king received the decree with disbelief, refusing to accept that words could unmake a crown. He responded with defiance, accusing the Pope of arrogance and unlawful authority. Yet beyond pride, fear crept in as allies began to quietly abandon him. The Pope waited calmly, believing time itself would force the king to kneel. Across Europe, priests repeated the decree, spreading fear from village to throne room. By winter's approach, the king faced a truth no ruler had faced before: obedience or destruction. When the decree spread through the kingdom, whispers turned into fear as nobles questioned whether a cursed king could still rule. The church's judgment struck deeper than steel, severing the king's divine bond in the eyes of his people. Priests refused prayers in the king's name, and churches fell silent where his authority once echoed. Without the church, the king's rule appeared hollow, his sacred protection stripped away by unseen judgment. Rebels stirred, claiming obedience to heaven mattered more than loyalty to a fallen crown. The king summoned his council, demanding loyalty as cracks formed beneath centuries of tradition. Some lords knelt, others hesitated, knowing eternity now weighed heavier than royal punishment. Beyond politics, the king felt isolation, as divine silence replaced the certainty of God's favor. Messengers brought grim news. Bishops withdrew support. Cities closed gates. Alliances quietly dissolved. The ancient kingdom, strong for generations, began fracturing under invisible spiritual pressure. Meanwhile in Rome, the Pope watched patiently, believing righteousness required endurance, not haste. He knew kings feared damnation more than death, and fear would do the church's work. As winter deepened, nobles demanded the king seek forgiveness or surrender his crown. They set a deadline, threatening to elect a new ruler blessed by the church. For the first time, the king understood his crown survived only by papal mercy. Pride battled survival as ancient royal dignity collapsed beneath spiritual isolation. Finally, the king chose humiliation over annihilation, deciding to face Rome itself. He would cross mountains in winter, not as ruler, but as penitent. Europe watched, stunned, as the unthinkable became inevitable. The road to Canossa began, marking the moment a king bowed before the church. The winter wind tore across the Alps as the king, stripped of royal pomp, began a journey that would shock all of Europe. He walked barefoot over frozen paths, sackcloth rough against his skin, humility forced by the weight of papal decree. Nobles who had once boasted of loyalty now watched silently, torn between obedience and fear of heaven. Every step toward Canossa reminded him that earthly power could vanish before spiritual authority. He knew the Pope waited, calm yet merciless, holding patience as a weapon sharper than any sword. The journey was not merely physical. It was a crossing from pride into a humbling unknown. Messengers and spies whispered along the roads, reporting the king's progress to anxious nobles and the waiting pope. Villagers stared as the humbled king passed, unable to reconcile the ruler with the man in sackcloth. Frost bit his hands, snow soaked his cloak, yet he pressed on, each step toward absolution, a step away from pride. The Alps tested his resolve with treacherous cliffs and hidden crevasses, mirroring the political dangers he had evaded. The Pope, cloistered within Canossa, understood the symbolic power of patience, letting the king endure rather than commanding immediate submission. Every night, the king prayed silently, fearing that heaven itself might reject him if he failed this penance. Nobles debated whether to reinforce loyalty or abandon him, the tension fracturing centuries of unquestioned fealty. Rumors spread of miraculous storms and divine signs along the king's path, adding urgency and fear to his journey. Some nobles secretly plotted rebellion, seeing opportunity in a king who had been spiritually declared unworthy. Still, the king's courage in enduring humiliation earned the silent respect of many who had doubted him. Through blizzards and icy winds, the journey became a symbol of obedience, punishment, and the fragile nature of power. Meanwhile, the Pope prepared his audience carefully, knowing every moment heightened the king's vulnerability. The world waited, breathless, as tradition, religion, and power collided on a narrow, snowy road. Thus, the stage was set for the ultimate confrontation between crown and altar, pride and divine authority. At the gates of Canossa, the king paused, shivering in the snow, his sackcloth soaked and his heart heavy with dread. and hope. He gazed upward at the towering walls, where the Pope waited in quiet judgment, unseen yet omnipotent in authority. Every step forward felt like defiance and submission simultaneously, a paradox of humility and desperation. The winter wind cut across his face, carrying whispers of nobles, clergy, and villagers who had witnessed his journey. Inside the fortress, the Pope prepared himself with solemnity, knowing history would remember this moment for eternity. The king knelt in the snow, unable to lift his eyes, surrendering both crown and pride to divine judgment. He begged forgiveness silently, knowing words were useless if they were not accompanied by genuine penance. The Pope, hidden within the hall, studied the king's approach, weighing mercy against justice and political precedent. Outside, courtiers and nobles watched in awe and fear, uncertain whether obedience or rebellion would shape the kingdom's future. Every heartbeat echoed the weight of centuries, the clash of divine authority against royal tradition finally materializing. The silence was almost unbearable as the king's submission became public, his fate resting in the Pope's concealed gaze. He had crossed mountains, braved storms, and endured humiliation, yet the weight of judgment had only just begun. For centuries, no king had approached a pope in such total surrender, setting a precedent that would alter power forever. The nobles waited nervously, unsure if this act of humility would save their realm or invite chaos. From within, the Pope considered mercy, understanding that patience had already achieved what threats could not. The king's humility was not weakness, but a calculated survival, a demonstration of obedience that few had witnessed. Even the villagers who had doubted him watched in stunned silence, recognizing the weight of divine confrontation. The gates of Canossa remained closed until the Pope decided the king's fate, heightening suspense for all witnesses. Every element of the landscape, the storm, the snow, the darkness, underscored the severity of this historic confrontation. Thus, the moment before absolution was suspended in time, the kingdom holding its breath as tradition and authority collided. The king remained kneeling in the snow for 3 days, enduring bitter winds and frozen ground, every moment a testament to humility and survival. Inside Canossa, the Pope observed silently, understanding that the king's endurance was proof that power could be tamed by spiritual authority. Courtiers and nobles outside whispered in awe and disbelief, witnessing a king transformed by fear, penance, and desperation. The king's cloak had frozen stiff, his feet numb, yet he did not move, each second reinforcing his submission before the church. He remembered the warnings of Rome, the excommunication, and the nobles' fear, realizing obedience was his only path to survival. The Pope considered his next move carefully, knowing mercy would demonstrate the Church's power more profoundly than anger. Outside the fortress, nobles debated whether to support the king or declare allegiance to a Church-approved successor. The king's humiliation became a spectacle, teaching all of Europe that spiritual authority could bend even the strongest rulers. Villagers watched from a distance, astonished, realizing a king could submit to divine law rather than wield force. The Pope remained seated, unmoving, allowing the penance to continue until it fully demonstrated the limits of earthly power. The king's suffering was both physical and political, as every passing hour weakened his influence and strengthened the Church. Each noble and bishop observing knew that history was being written in the snow and frost of Canossa. Even the harsh winter seemed to enforce the gravity of submission, as if nature itself conspired to test the king's humility. For the king, Every shiver and frozen footstep was a reminder that obedience now outweighed pride. Fear outweighed authority. The Pope observed the ritual silently, knowing that patience would eventually transform submission into an unquestionable symbol of church supremacy. Outside the walls, messengers traveled swiftly to spread word of the king's penance, reaching distant kingdoms in awe and fear. The king's kneeling figure became a symbol of submission, humility, and the intertwining of political and spiritual power. For days, the tension held Europe in suspense, with nobles, clergy, and peasants alike witnessing the limits of earthly kingship. Every breath he drew in icy air reinforced the lesson. No crown could defy the authority of God's representative. Thus, as winter's cold and the Pope's gaze converged, the king endured, and Europe realized a new era of church supremacy had begun. After 3 days of kneeling in the snow, the king's endurance had impressed even the most skeptical nobles, clergy, and distant observers across Europe. The Pope, seated in the high hall, finally decided the time had come to offer absolution, a moment that would define history. The gates of Canossa opened slowly, and the king rose from the snow, trembling, yet holding a newfound respect for the church's authority. He approached the Pope cautiously, head bowed, aware that a single misstep could undo the delicate balance of mercy and power. The nobles watched in stunned silence, realizing that absolution was not just forgiveness, but a statement that the Church controlled the fate of kings. The Pope extended a hand, signaling both grace and authority, demonstrating that divine power could be tempered by calculated mercy. Kneeling once more, the king received absolution, the heavy weight of excommunication lifting like a shadow fading at sunrise. A collective sigh seemed to echo through the fortress, as if the stones themselves acknowledged the shift in power. Europe witnessed a new precedent. Kings could endure humiliation, yet only the Church could restore their sacred authority. The absolution transformed the king, his pride tempered by submission, teaching all rulers the tangible force of spiritual authority. Some nobles muttered doubts, but fear and respect solidified their loyalty to both crown and church. The Pope's hand remained extended, a silent reminder that absolution did not remove ultimate authority. Obedience remained mandatory. Snow began to melt under the courtyard torches, symbolic of a kingdom emerging from the frost of fear into the warmth of structured obedience. The king's gaze met the Pope's, a moment of understanding passing silently, binding crown and church in a new hierarchy. Europe would speak of Canossa for generations, the king's humility becoming a story of obedience, fear, and power intertwined. The absolution restored his crown, yet his experience remained a reminder that defiance against spiritual authority came at a grave cost. As he descended the steps from Canossa, the kingdom watched, understanding the limits of royal power and the Church's reach. The journey back to his capital was both triumphant and solemn, as the weight of obedience and history traveled with him. Messengers carried word of his absolution throughout Europe, establishing that the Pope's judgment could alter the fate of any kingdom. Thus, the absolution at Canossa became a historic turning point, blending fear, obedience, and divine authority into a single, unforgettable event. The king began his journey back through snow-laden passes, humbled yet strengthened, aware that the Church had forever reshaped his authority. Villages along the road watched silently as the king passed, awe and fear etched into every face, acknowledging his transformed status. Nobles who had once questioned his authority now whispered loyalty, knowing the church's judgment had reinforced his rule. Every step through the snow carried a lesson of submission, humility, and the unshakable influence of spiritual power. The Pope remained in Rome watching letters and reports, satisfied that the king's obedience would inspire rulers across Christendom. The king's return was both triumphant and solemn, a paradox where victory over humiliation became the mark of true power. Peasants whispered tales of Canossa, where the mighty had knelt, and a simple act of obedience reshaped kingdoms. The nobles accompanying him carried mixed feelings: awe, fear, and relief at the king's restored but humbled authority. Every messenger carried news of absolution to distant lands, ensuring that the Pope's power was recognized beyond the Alps. The king reflected on his journey. 3 days in snow, fear, endurance, and the undeniable weight of divine authority. He realized that obedience, not defiance, had preserved his crown, a lesson that would resonate through generations. Nobles whispered strategies and prayers, interpreting his survival as a miracle of both human endurance and church authority. The king's humility became a powerful symbol, reminding rulers that spiritual sanction outweighed armies and treasure. Even his enemies acknowledged that Canossa had shifted the balance of power across Christendom. As he neared his capital, townspeople lined the roads, uncertain whether to celebrate a king or witness a penitent servant of the church. The king's cloak, once torn and frozen, now bore the marks of endurance, a silent testimony to the power of spiritual obedience. Reports of his penance reached neighboring kingdoms, ensuring that rulers far beyond his realm would heed the authority of the church. Upon entering the capital, he was greeted with cautious respect, the echoes of Canossa preceding him like a shadow of authority. Every citizen sensed that their king had survived humiliation, teaching them that power must coexist with humility and obedience. Thus, the king returned triumphant and subdued, his crown intact, yet forever marked by the spiritual authority that had bent even the strongest monarch. Back in his capital, the king regained control, yet every action carried the weight of his submission, reminding nobles that obedience was paramount. Courts, once divided by ambition, now listened intently, the lesson of Canossa echoing in every hall and council chamber. The church's authority extended beyond Rome, and even distant rulers whispered caution when discussing disobedience. Every decree the king issued now bore the invisible weight of papal sanction, blending political power with spiritual oversight. Nobles who once plotted rebellion now bowed cautiously, acknowledging that defiance carried more than earthly consequences. Even distant lands sent envoys, eager to learn the limits of royal authority when checked by spiritual power. The king understood that his restored crown symbolized both victory and humility, a fragile balance he could not ignore. The church, satisfied with obedience, sent letters reinforcing the king's legitimacy, ensuring his rule would endure. Courtiers moved with new caution, their ambitions tempered by the visible reminder that spiritual authority could override even kings. The king called a council, ensuring all decisions reflected the lessons learned at Canossa, blending wisdom with restrained power. Messengers carried the story to distant regions, making clear that defiance against the church could invite exile, loss, or worse. Villagers spoke of the king who had knelt in snow, reminding all that even rulers were bound by obedience to higher authority. His crown now carried the weight not only of sovereignty but of learned humility, a constant reminder of Canossa's lesson. The nobles, though careful, recognized that obedience, ensured both survival and favor, their ambitions now restrained by caution. Diplomatic envoys arrived to observe his rule, knowing that his penance had reshaped the rules of authority. The Church's influence extended further than ever before, a silent force guiding kings and shaping politics across Europe. The king implemented reforms quietly, strengthening loyalty while subtly acknowledging the authority that had once humbled him. Every public appearance carried the lesson of Canossa. Humility, tempered with authority, created stability and respect. He became a ruler both feared and admired, a living reminder that spiritual oversight could guide even kings. Thus, the king's restored authority was secured, tempered by humility, and forever intertwined with the invisible power of the Church. Years passed, yet the story of Canossa endured, a timeless reminder that even kings were bound by spiritual authority and humility. The Pope's influence spread across Europe, shaping diplomacy, politics, and kingship in ways that echoed for generations. Nobles and courtiers remembered the king's humility, altering their ambitions to align with the Church's invisible yet absolute power. The king's crown remained, but its meaning had changed. It symbolized not just sovereignty, but obedience to higher judgment. Every decree, every law, and every diplomatic decision carried the subtle weight of Canossa's lesson in humility. The Church's authority became a guiding force, teaching rulers across kingdoms that spiritual obedience shaped survival. The king's journey, once a path of humiliation, became legend, inspiring both fear and respect in the hearts of subjects. Villagers recounted the tale of his kneeling in snow beneath the unseen gaze of the Pope, passing lessons of obedience to future generations. Nobles, humbled by this demonstration, enforced order cautiously, avoiding rebellion that could summon spiritual wrath. The king often reflected on Canossa, realizing that submission had preserved both life and crown, forever altering his rule. Messengers carried the tale across kingdoms, ensuring defiance against spiritual authority would not be forgotten. The Pope's influence remained subtle yet omnipresent, reminding rulers that obedience could outweigh armies. The king's council grew disciplined, understanding that spiritual authority could not be ignored. Even distant kingdoms adjusted alliances and diplomacy in respect of the Church's unseen power. The king's reign endured, tempered by humility, reflecting a journey from pride to submission. Confident in its authority, the Church allowed kings to rule, knowing obedience had reshaped their governance. The legacy of Canossa became a model for Europe, teaching that humility, fear, and obedience were instruments of survival. Generations remembered the kneeling king, the patient pope, and the triumph of spiritual authority over temporal might. Historians chronicled the event as proof that even the strongest monarchs could be humbled by divine influence. Thus, Canossa endured in memory, a lasting testament to submission, authority, and the eternal power of the Church over kings, shaping Europe forever.